Welcome back to FPI's 2015 Forum, The Strength to Lead. It is a pleasure to welcome you back to a session that will focus on the Asia-Pacific region where the United States has so many allies that ask the question that really gets to the heart of our forum this year. Will the United States retain the strength to lead in light of China's growing military strength, construction of military airstrips in disputed waters, and aggressive cyber espionage activities? To discuss this question, it is a privilege to be joined by Senator Cory Gardner and Senator Dan Sullivan, moderated in conversation by Josh Rogin. Before introducing our speakers, I want to take just a minute to briefly note a pair of publications that you may have seen on your way in, FPI's Foreign Policy 2015, and a joint publication with the American Enterprise Institute, State of the Military, a defense primer. That these publications reflect FPI's commitment to providing educational briefings for candidates, legislators, and their staff. And the versions here are literally hot off the presses. We have a couple of copies here, and they're certainly available online as well. The questions that we tried to address here, we're very fortunate to have two members of the Senate to really flesh out for us today. Senator Cory Gardner was elected in 2014 to represent Colorado in the United States Senate. Among his committee assignments, he sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he chairs the SFRC East Asia, Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Subcommittee. Previously, Senator Gardner moved from the private sector to serve on the staff of Senator Wayne Allard of Colorado. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 2010, where he focused much of his work on energy policy. Senator Dan Sullivan was also elected in 2014 and represents Alaska in the United States Senate. Among his committee assignments, he sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he's been designated as the lead for the committee's oversight of the rebalance, the pivot of U.S. military activities in the Asia-Pacific. Previously, he served as Alaska's Attorney General and as its Commissioner of Natural Resources. Moderating the conversation will be Josh Rogin, who is a Bloomberg View columnist who writes about national security and foreign policy. Perhaps a little-known fact is that Josh began his career as a journalist writing for Japan's Asahi Shimbun, and of course, he still follows the region very closely. Thank you, Josh, for moderating, and please join me in welcoming Senators Gardner and Sullivan. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out to our Asia panel today. The first rule of panels is don't stand between an audience and their lunch. But we have about 45 minutes to talk about Asia, so we'll get right to it. I have about 30 minutes of opening remarks.
So do we.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Okay, so we're right on schedule. Now, as Chris mentioned, I began studying Asia even before I worked at the Asahi Shimbun at GW back in 1990. And I was told that this would be the Asian century. And we're still waiting on that. It's about 15 years in, but there's still time. And I went to live in Asia, and I studied Japanese, and I went to work for the Japanese newspaper. I eventually hit what they call the rice paper ceiling. That's if you're the American there's no upward mobility for you. So I went to work at CQ, Congressional Quarterly, and I covered the Senate. And at that time, this was around the mid-aughts, there was a group of very senior, very well-established senators who cared a lot about Asia. Among them were Daniel Inouye, Daniel Akaka, Richard Lugar, Pete Domenici, Ted Kennedy, and John Warner. All of those Senate leaders are now no longer in the Senate. But I remember one particular story when I was covering the nomination of the U.S. ambassador to South Korea. It was being held up by Sam Brownback. And I saw Senator Warner in the hallway. And Senator Warner came up to me, and I said, Senator Warner, what are we going to do about this? And he puts his hand on my shoulder. I think so he wouldn't fall over. And he says to me, Josh, I fought in Korea. I had friends that died in Korea. I'll always look out for those little guys. That's what he said. So now, we have a new generation of senators who are learning about Asia, who are learning to be leaders in Asia, and we have two of the most prominent here today, so we're very lucky. Senator Gardner is the chairman of the Asia policy and international cyber policy. We have an international cyber policy?
We do now.
Okay.
Yes.
And Senator Sullivan.
Are you talking about the committee or the actual policy? We can get into the policy. The committee, yes. The policy?
Okay. Excellent. Let me
We'll get
begin
into
with
that.
you for a few remarks, then we'll go to Senator Sullivan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You want to open remarks? Right? Okay.
Yes,
Thank you very
please.
much for the opportunity to be with you this morning and for braving the weather. It looks like it may get worse, as they say, before the calm before the storm, so to speak. So thank you very much for the chance to be this morning. I look at what is happening around the globe, and while our day-to-day focus seems to be, and rightfully so, in the Middle East, particularly in recent days with Syria, with Russia's activity into Syria, our long-term interests really do lie in the Asia region. If you look at what has happened in China over the last several decades and the last several years, it's truly remarkable what they have been able to accomplish, lifting 500 million people out of poverty. But the question is what we are going to do to make sure that a rising China, who wishes everything to be a great nation, truly is a great nation that fits alongside of great nations that adhere to international norms of behavior and follow the rules of the road of a truly great nation. And right now, when it comes to questions of economy, when it comes to questions of security and expansion in the South China Sea and questions of the East China Sea, when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to intellectual property, right now they are not meeting those goals that they will need in order to become that truly responsible great nation that can be a part of a world that truly needs leadership on these issues. And so I just last month had the chance and opportunity to visit in China. I was in Beijing, I was in South Korea, in Japan, Hong Kong, meeting with leaders, meeting with elected officials, and meeting with American businesses to talk about the challenges that we face in the region and the opportunity that we face in the region. I think there are some tremendous opportunities. Look at Trans-Pacific Partnership. Right now, Senator Sullivan, I know, will be talking about the rebalance and the pivot. Right now, if you look at what is happening, our rebalance is seen primarily through the perspective of a military rebalance. We have to pass and put forward TPP in order to move beyond simply a military dimension of the rebalance. Because when you talk to people in the region, when you talk to leaders here, that's a one-sided policy right now that needs to be multi-dimensional. And so we have opportunities, but the challenges that we face are truly real and could lead to greater conflict if we don't take them seriously. And what is seriously? Seriously means that we move beyond rhetoric on the South China Sea and we move into action. Serious moves beyond rhetoric on cyber security issues, and that we move into action. And serious means that when it comes to economic issues, whether it's their new national laws that could threaten the security of our corporations, when it comes to the billions of dollars of international property theft each year, of which I believe it was Admiral Blair and Ambassador Huntsman predicted that of the $300 billion in intellectual property theft, 80% came from China. We've got to solve these problems. And so we have very serious issues if we are going to be a significant partner in a region of the world that will represent half of the world's population, half of the world's economy, and indeed that long-term future of our national interests.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan, could you give some
Thanks,
opening?
Josh. Great to be with Cory. Thank you, everybody, and appreciate the FPI for putting this on. You know, a little bit about my background. I've had the opportunity in my career to kind of view Asia from a couple different lenses. You know, if you look at a map, Alaska is certainly an Asia-Pacific state. So as a state official in Alaska, like a lot of state officials, I was out in China and Japan and other places, Korea, with regard to our economic opportunities. I also served in the Bush administration as an Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the economic, energy, finance, terrorist finance portfolios under Secretary Rice. So I spent a lot of time in China, a lot of time in Japan, a lot of time in other parts of Asia on that. And then also as a member of the military. I'm a Marine Lieutenant Colonel, still in the reserves, but have deployed out to that part of the world as a Marine. And then I was U.S. Senators. Josh mentioned very interested in the region. Like Cory, I've already had a couple trips out there. One, I was at the Shangri-La dialogue with Senator McCain, Senator Reid, Senator Ernst. I did confirm with Josh, who I saw out there at a bar, that whatever I said at the bar would not be quoted here, as long as whatever he said at the bar would not be quoted here. So
Mutually assured
are
destruction.
we still good to go on that?
Yes.
All right, just checking. Okay. So, but just a couple thoughts from my perspective. I think all of you recognize that American foreign policy is at its strongest when the executive branch and the legislative branch are working together, when the parties, Democrats and Republicans, are working together. And that's certainly a way, if you look at our history, that's kind of been the tradition on major foreign policy issues. It's also the way the Constitution is actually set up to share that kind of authority. And I think in the good news front with regard to the so-called rebalance, there has been a sense of bipartisan and executive and legislative coming together on that strategy of President Obama. So if you look at the NDAA, that the defense authorization bill that we're going to be taking up here on the Senate floor, just got out of conference, there's a strong amendment in there. It was actually an amendment that I drafted that really focuses on the importance of the rebalance, passed out of the Armed Services Committee unanimously. As Cory mentioned, trade, right? A lot of us worked hard on the TPA vote, which passed by one vote. A lot of Republicans, I think, worked with the president and his cabinet to move forward on that. The military rebalance is something I've been very interested in. A lot of people say, hey, maybe it doesn't exist. But I think it does to some degree. And then there's another element of the rebalance that I like to talk about, not just the trade and military strategy, but it should also include energy. We have a huge opportunity in this country in terms of energy that we didn't have 10 years ago in terms of exports of LNG, in terms of exports of oil. And the Asian economies need it, want it, and it's a great way to deepen our economic and even energy and even security relationships with opening that element of a rebalance. And I've been trying to convince the White House and all the cabinet and the Obama administration, hey, this should be a three-pronged strategy: trade, military, energy. But that's the good news. The bad news, in my view, is that our credibility, even on this important strategy, is starting to decline, like it is in a lot of the world with regard to America's steadfastness on key foreign policy issues. Why? It's one thing to talk about your policy. It's one thing to make statements about policy objectives. It's quite another to act on them. And the difference between talk and action is starting to become very apparent, certainly in other parts of the world, Syria, the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia. Unfortunately, I think it's starting to creep into our Asia-Pacific strategy, our rebalance strategy. Let me give you one obvious, important example. When we were at the Shangri-La Dialogue, we made a point of doing what I mentioned at the outset. Meeting with Secretary Carter, bipartisan meeting, literally walking around the conference together, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the Secretary of Defense, a Republican, a Democrat, the ranking member on the Armed Services, some of the new members like myself and Senator Ernst. We were doing that purposely. Hey, this is the United States. We're working together, bipartisan, executive, legislative. Secretary Carter, I thought, gave a very good speech, a powerful speech. If you read it, a lot of people were waiting on what he had to say. And he was talking about the South China Sea. He was talking about our ability and goal to fly and sail anywhere, the way we have for decades. And then he even said a submerged reef, whether it's built up or not, does not provide sovereignty that we need to respect. This is a strong statement. Okay, what have we done? Well, we're not following up on that. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people, and I think it became clear in an Armed Services Committee hearing with the PACOM commander recently. He didn't say it exactly, but if you look at the testimony in that hearing, the military is interested in sailing the way Secretary Carter mentioned, including inside the 12-mile limit of some of these islands. And yet, it's also very apparent that the White House seems to not want to do that. I think that's a strategic mistake. And came out in this testimony, we haven't done that since 2012. Why does that matter? I'll finish with one anecdote that has a little bit of a personal meaning to me. Some of you who have been Asia hands might recall what happened in the spring of 1996, now referred to as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. China had moved forces close to Taiwan, was shooting missiles in terms of a provocation with regard to the Taiwanese presidential election. President Clinton surged 2 carrier battle groups to the region. Not 1, 2. It was a show of American resolve. During the time, there was a debate, and I remember hearing on the radio a show, I can't remember exactly what it was, but a debate saying, hey, this is kind of provocative. Someone else on the show was saying, no, we actually need to send naval shipping through the Taiwan Strait, because right now China is saying the Taiwan Strait is their internal waterway. I remember that because I was a Marine infantry officer, a lieutenant at the time, on a Marine amphibious assault ship, a very large vessel, in the Taiwan Strait, right when that happened. We did send a ship through the Taiwan Strait during that time. It was a ship that I was actually on.
Wow.
And that was a demonstration of American resolve. Was it risky? Some say it was risky, but others, and I would argue this, it's a lot riskier to actually accept de facto pronouncements by countries that, in my view, don't represent what the international community focuses on. So we actually regularly do that still as a U.S. Navy. And I think that it's important to remember we can't lose our credibility in this part of the world. There are other allies, other countries who are looking for American leadership. I think we have the opportunity to present it. I think we have an opportunity to work in a bipartisan way with the president on this policy, but we need to bolster our credibility, not undermine it.
Thank you, Senator. I'll start off with a few questions, then we'll go to the audience. Following up, Senator Sullivan, on what you just said, you noted that the U.S. has not operated within 12 miles of those disputed territories. I think in the testimony it was since 2012.
Correct.
Yet last month, Chinese ships were found to be operating within 12 miles of your state. Today it was announced that China has quietly begun construction on its first domestic aircraft carrier. From your position on the Senate Armed Services Committee, what do you think is China's blue water strategy here, and what should the U.S. do to respond?
Well, look, I asked the question. Obviously, it was kind of interesting for me as Alaska's senator to be home when China was sailing near my great state. It was interesting. And the question I had asked Admiral Harris was if that was a provocation. The reason I asked if it was a provocation because we had a certain visitor in Alaska at the time. His name was President Obama. And I was serious. I said, look, you think this is a coincidence, or you think that was a provocation in terms of, hey, the president's in Alaska, now we're... And I don't think they had a clear answer. And to be honest, I'm not sure that anybody knows. The only issue there, I thought that the Department of Defense response was almost muted. It was almost apologetic. Hey, they're operating off the coast of Alaska, it's no problem. And in many ways, it is not a huge issue. It's very interesting because that's an extensive deployment for 5 Chinese naval ships. But those of us who are encouraging a Navy response that's within the 12-mile zone of some of these submerged reefs that have been built up are not doing it to be provocative. We're doing it because otherwise we're going to essentially let facts on the ground change the situation, and we'll be in many ways de facto recognizing what I think certainly our military and most of the other members of the foreign policy community within the United States, even in the president's own administration, don't recognize.
Thank you,
Senator.
Senator.
Secretary Carter didn't recognize it. So I think we need to keep a close eye on this issue.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Gardner, you mentioned action on cyber. The biggest topic in the recent summit between the presidents of the United States and China was cyber policy. They claim to have signed the first arms control agreement for cyber. The biggest hack of federal information in history, in U.S. history, was when the Chinese took all of the personnel data from OPM. We heard that there were going to be sanctions. Then there weren't going to be sanctions. Now we hear there might be sanctions. There might not be sanctions. What is your evaluation as head of the subcommittee on the response to that hack? Do you think this agreement is a real thing, or is that just window dressing, and what should be done next?
Well, look, I think there's a commonality in my opening comments and Senator Sullivan's opening comments and the response to the first question to Senator Sullivan and the response to the cyber question. And it's this. We have an administration that continues to lead from behind. President Xi is taking this issue of cybersecurity very seriously. In fact, he recognizes that cyber isn't just the flavor of the month. It's going to define for generations our security policy, our economic policy, our personal privacy issues. And in fact, it's so seriously he's taking it that he's actually the head of this new cyber committee in China. I met last month with Liu Wei, the new head of the cyber administration in China, to talk about what they are doing. And this agreement that was reached last week, time will tell what it is, but it doesn't do anything about OPM. It doesn't address OPM issues at all. Raise your hand if you think the Chinese have your fingerprints. There's exactly right. And so, I mean, there was nothing publicly stated either before the event or after the summit about OPM. And so this agreement, while it's a modest first step about economic or commercial espionage, only time will tell how much information that we're going to give to them, how much information they're going to give back. But we also have to recognize that under the new national security laws that China is in process of putting in place, will they simply ignore this cyber agreement because they'll say, you know, it's against our new our national laws on national security. And so we need to have tough public diplomacy when it comes to cyber. We still don't have that. We could have called in ambassadors. The president could have called President Xi. The president should have talked about it and blamed people long before August recess came around. And so, again, this is the first of many steps that need to be taken. I personally believe that Congress has to do a better job. Right now, you mentioned that I'm the head of the new Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia Pacific and Cyber Strategy.
International cyber
policy. So we have foreign relations that now has a cyber component. SASC with a cyber component. Homeland Security with a cyber component. Intel with a cyber component. Commerce with a cyber component. We need to have a select committee on cyber policy in the Senate that can take the heads of these committees, the chairs, ranking members of the committees, their designee, put them on a committee so that we can have a whole of government view about what we should do with cyber policy. We have an amendment pending to the cyber bill that requires the State Department, which doesn't yet have a cyber strategy, to develop a cyber strategy. And then we ought to review the 2011 cyber framework that the White House put out because we haven't had one since 2011.
Thank you. What did that Chinese official say to you when you met him?
Well, I think I agreed that he would come to my hometown and I would go to his hometown. I think that was part of our conversation. But we also talked about how they would like just more information about what we think occurred. Again, but it's a sign that they're not taking us seriously on cyber policy. We can't just throw a thesaurus through the 12-mile zone use words to try to describe how this is against international law. We can't just throw new policies at China without backing them up. We need to codify sanctions, we need to pursue sanctions, and we need to continue making sure that we're not just talking, but we're actually acting.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Sullivan, not only China, but also Russia have increased their operations in the Arctic.
Yeah.
How are we doing with our Arctic policy? What else needs to be done, and what do you see the Asian powers, including China and Russia, doing next year?
We're not doing well on our Arctic policy, and this has become a new area. You've probably seen in press reports a significant increase in the interest of major powers like Russia, like China, and for good reason. It's looking like it's going to be a very important transportation route for the entire globe. It's obviously a place where there's enormous resources. So you see what's become quite, in many ways, almost shockingly, a militarization of the Arctic, particularly with regard to Russia. So in the last year, they have stood up a brand new Arctic Command. They've stood up four new brigade combat teams in the Arctic, 13 new airfields, and conducted an exercise that I think took a lot of us by surprise in the Arctic that was enormous by any standards, probably one of the biggest Arctic exercises in decades. What are we doing? The Department of Defense has announced that they are going to remove the only airborne brigade combat team in the Asia Pacific and the Arctic. Now, that's happened to be based in Alaska. So I actually think that's not good for my state, certainly, but I really don't think it's good for the national defense of our country. So we are acting. Congress is acting. In the NDAA, another amendment that I put forward, and again was unanimously approved by the committee, there will be a provision that requires the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, to put together an O plan, an operations plan for the Arctic. And for those of you who understand what that means, that's a serious endeavor for the military to seriously look. Right now, the Department of Defense has a defense strategy for the Arctic that is 13 pages, 7 of which are pictures. There's a footnote, 1, mentioning Russia. Climate change is mentioned 6 times in the strategy. It's not a serious strategy. So Congress is demanding that we do have a serious strategy. And again, we need to work with our allies. And this is very bipartisan. The number of senators on the Armed Services Committee who are taking an interest in these Arctic issues has risen dramatically. So I think we're acting, and I think you're going to see a lot more activity. Armed Services Committee is likely going to hold a hearing in the next 2 months on our Arctic strategy and the importance of it for the country. So Congress is paying attention. Even Secretary Carter has admitted how key the Arctic is and how we're late to the game. So we need to catch up.
Thank you, thank you. Senator Gardner, you just came back from a trip. You went to many places, including Hong Kong. We're about exactly 1 year from the beginning of the pro-democracy and protests that took over Hong Kong. Can you give us an update? You've spoken with the leaders there. What is the state of that movement? Was any real progress made? Is there still the possibility of further unrest? How has China responded?
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I think there was an article in the New York Times about the umbrella movement, the protests that occurred in Hong Kong with tens of thousands of people that came together real spontaneously. And I met with protesters, leaders of the movement while I was in Hong Kong. I met with legislative council members as well as the chief executive in Hong Kong. And I can tell you that there is great concern about the future of democracy, this special administration zone, the region, and what it means to have autonomy. And if you look at freedom of the press, for instance, I think one of the indexes has moved freedom of the press from Hong Kong from some of the most free press rules, policies in the world to now somewhere in the 70s. Great concern about influence that is impacting freedom of the press. They still believe they have a very strong and independent judiciary in Hong Kong, but obviously there's concern about what happens if you lose the rule of law in Hong Kong. I've talked to businesses, both here, American businesses here, financial service companies that do business in Hong Kong, companies located in Hong Kong, who are talking about their concern with sort of the infiltration or loss of this freedom. So what's the future of the movement? Look what happened. China's now filing charges against 2 of the students who are in college kids that walk around town in Hong Kong with a backpack. You couldn't pick them out from any other college student in America. But yet these 2 in Hong Kong had perhaps some more influence than any member of Congress has had over the future of people in Hong Kong. And they're very concerned about what is going to happen next and how they are going to promote democracy in Hong Kong and how they maintain the rule of law. So I think, again, we have to make sure as a country that we are leading, that we are constantly standing behind Hong Kong and making sure that the agreements that have been entered into are matched and met, and that there is no backslide into more and more government control.
Do you believe the Obama administration's attitude and statements and policy toward Hong Kong has been robust enough?
I don't think the Obama administration's reactions have been robust on the arc of foreign diplomacy.
Thank you. And one more before I go to the audience. Senator Sullivan, you mentioned Taiwan. I'm old enough to remember a time here in Washington when there was a lot of discussion about Taiwan. We used to have legislation pushing for certain armaments. We used to have high-level visits to Taiwan. It seems to be out of the news.
Yeah.
What's the responsibility of lawmakers, especially on these relevant committees, to continue the U.S. commitment to Taiwan? Do you feel that that commitment has been abrogated, and what needs to be done to it?
I mean, I don't feel it's been abrogated, and you know, it's an important component of our overall strategy. And as you know, and as you mentioned, with the involvement of the Congress, the Senate and the House have played a very important role in terms of really shaping that element of American foreign policy. As I said at the outset, it's one of those areas, though, that's gotten a lot of bipartisan support. And I think that's where we are the strongest. And I think on that issue, I don't see a lot of daylight between the executive branch and the Congress right now. But I will mention this kind of, Josh, just to kind of broaden the point of your question, is that, you know, we have a lot of focus on the Middle East, a lot of focus on terrorism. There's a lot of smart foreign policy, former officials, current foreign policy thinkers who view that the rise, or as some would say, the reemergence of China in the Asia-Pacific is the number one foreign policy and national security issue the United States and our allies will be dealing with for the next generation. And I happen to agree with that. And I think there's huge opportunities. This shouldn't all be negative. I spent a lot of time in China. There's huge opportunities to work with China on a whole host of important issues, certainly on the economic issues. And there's obviously challenges. Cory and I had the opportunity last Friday to meet with President Xi Jinping when he came to Congress. So we were one of the 5 Republicans who got to sit down with him. And you know, it was a very good discussion. But he had talked about, and I had actually given a speech on the Senate floor just a few hours earlier. He's been using this term called the Thucydides trap. Some of you might be familiar with. This is a term coined by Graham Allison at Harvard about, you know, when you see in history rising powers challenging an established power, that historically oftentimes that doesn't turn out so well. And Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War, and that was what happened with Sparta and Athens. Well, the president of China is talking about this in speeches to us.
Is he for it or against it?
He's against it.
Okay, just wanted to make that clear.
And so should we be. And I think it's actually a serious issue, right? And the seriousness for me is 2 things. A, we as a federal government, as Congress, as members of Congress, need to be paying a lot more attention to this. But B, and this kind of seems a little bit incongruous to the broader discussion of foreign policy, to me the most important way we avoid that trap is being strong at home. We have a strong economy that's actually growing again, which is something we haven't done in years. Traditional levels of American economic growth. This is something that ultimately is going to underpin so much, in my view, of our foreign policy in Asia, of our military. It's the key, and it's often something that is overlooked. We keep growing at these horrible low rates, the new normal, as they call it here in Washington, of 1.5%, 2% GDP growth. We're going to have problems at home, but we're also going to have problems overseas. We need to be stronger back here.
Great, and very quickly, you both met with President Xi. Give us a couple of words. What was your impression of him? What did you learn about him? What did you think of the man?
Absolutely. You know, we had time to talk about South China Sea. We talked a little bit about cyber. And again, I think they had the foreign minister was there along with a number of other officials in the room. And we have a lot more work to do. And it's going to take a lot more than just an hour or hour and a half in some room in the Capitol to break through on these issues. And whether it's Hong Kong and voting rights, whether it's administration, cyber administration and our policies and OPM, we have to engage.
What about the guy, President Xi?
Firm in his beliefs and unyielding. And that's why we have to. We can't just simply back away or talk and throw rhetoric. We have to actually back it up with action. That's why this 12-mile zone is so important, that we actually back up what Secretary Carter said at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is we will sail, fly, and operate anywhere that we've always operated under national law.
Great. Firm and unyielding. Your impression of President Xi?
Well, I think it was a good meeting, direct both ways, right? So you had members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, asking direct questions.
What did you think of the man himself? What was your impression?
Seems very intelligent, very committed to his country, and somebody who, we're going to need to be focused on dealing with him and his leadership. I think
All right,
he was direct, and I think we were direct, and I think in some ways that's actually very useful. I will say, though, I saw a transcript from his press conference with President Obama and a statement along the lines of, we don't engage in cyber theft or things like that. I'm not sure that's the prevailing view in the United States. But seriously, those kind of statements in front of the American people with the President of the United States standing next to you, that does undermine his credibility.
You're saying he lied?
You said that.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Could I have hands for questions? Please put your comments in the form of a question, and please let us know who you are and what is your affiliation. Yes, sir, in the back. And the mic will be coming around, so please wait for it to get to you.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. You both met with Xi Jinping, but there are a number of things that have happened. Like about a month ago, I'd read that there were some Christian churches destroyed in coastal province, and Xi Jinping can't blame that on his predecessor. He can only blame that on himself. And I think they have pictures of Chairman Mao in China, Reverend Chairman Mao. And after World War II, there were Jewish investigators who stopped that sort of thing with the Nazis. So there's been a lot of things going on. And back in the 18th and 19th century, I believe, there's something called the kowtow, whereby European leaders put their forehead down, touch their forehead to show obeisance to the Chinese ruler. Is there too much kowtowing right now of U.S. leaders to China? Because I've never known a Chinese leader to be accountable for atrocities at all.
Okay. Who wants to field that one? Senator Sullivan?
I think you raise a really good point. And again, this goes back to my initial points about bipartisan, strong commitment from the legislative and executive branch. And that's with regard to human rights, particularly dealing with authoritarian regimes. That has been a tradition of U.S. foreign policy, whether it's a president who's a Democrat or Republican, for decades. I witnessed it. I was in meetings with President Bush and President Hu Jintao. Okay, President Bush raised these issues. He did. I saw it. Okay, one of the disappointments of this administration, and it's in the press and everything, is how they downplayed that element of our relationship with China over the last 6 years. That is not a way to advance our interests as a nation. And I think that's been a strategic mistake, because it looks like then we don't care. And we do care. You care. I care. Americans care.
I care.
And we need to, but we need to show that through our leaders. And I think we haven't done a good enough job with President Obama subordinating those concerns over the last several years. That has not been a policy that's bipartisan or has advanced America's interest.
Well, I think the issue of human rights is again something that we should have seen more focus on. During the summit, in the days leading up to the summit, the days after the summit. Just a couple of days ago, I held a hearing in the subcommittee with Chris Johnson and others talking about the aftermath of the summit, what we achieved, what we fell short of, and what we should be doing looking forward. And we talked about human rights, the fact that they're jailing lawyers, their concern over treatment of Christians in China. I think there is a need for more focus on human rights in China. Again, it goes back to that point. If China wants to be a rising nation, and we hope they will be a great nation that works with the world in terms of international norms and rules of the road, violating human rights is no way to do that. And so that's something that we should focus on more.
Quick follow-up. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton famously said in 2009 when visiting China that we shouldn't let human rights get in the way of the broader relationship. Do you think that she, as Secretary of State, set the wrong tone and sent the wrong
Well, it's
message?
probably in one of the 2-month emails we haven't seen yet. But I think that she set the wrong tone. I mean, how do you tell somebody that, well, let's just ignore human rights and try to do other things? We can't do that.
Thank you. Next question. Young lady in the front. Could you please identify yourself?
Hi there, I'm Allie Weinberg with ABC News. I wanted to ask you about TPP. What are your predictions for when TPP will be completed? Is it going to happen during the Obama administration? Or are we going to have to wait until the next administration? And do you think there's a role for China in TPP? Or is it more advantageous for all the parties in TPP to keep China on the outside? Thank you.
Not soon enough. When's the time frame? Not soon. We've got to get this done sooner rather than later. I want to see this done now. We need to get this agreed to. I think they've recently restarted the talks, the conversations. I know dairy policy and some other issues are hanging up the conversations right now. But as soon as we can get it, we start the 60-day time frame, the clock on TPA, so that we can vote on this. Look, I'd like to see it done this year. I know that is way probably naive and optimistic, but I'm from Colorado. We're always looking up to the Rocky Mountains, so we have to look up to the opportunity for TPP as well. In regards to China and TPP, obviously, TPP has them very concerned about what's happening. I think but that's why we need to do it, to work with the nations represented in TPP to build a strong relationship. They're trying to do it with nations that are in the agreement as well. And so eventually, perhaps this will show what a organization can do. I think the first steps to that are the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty. That's what they're working on right now. They sent over a negative list on the BIT that was pretty objectionable by most standards. They have revised that. You sort of hear mixed messages on whether their second transmittal, the negative list, was acceptable or not. People think it seemed to have some good progress, but more work to be done. But I do think that's why we see more progress, at least a few more steps being taken now on the BIT than we did before.
And from my perspective, I think I would agree with everything that Cory mentioned. We are certainly encouraging. I had a call with Ambassador Froman a couple weeks ago, them to finish. It's important to, the president's been focused on this. And I think the president's done a good job about talking how this is a strategic agreement. Our free trade agreements are very different from almost any other country's free trade agreements. They are very detailed on critical issues, IPR, investment. And when the president talks about, hey, we need to make sure we're writing the rules of the road in terms of economics and international trade, not China. I think that's important. And I think that there's a lot of countries in the region that certainly want to be part of it. Korea's not part of it. I think they're interested. So I certainly don't think TPP would be ready for China anytime in the foreseeable future. But what's key about it is it sets the standards. And then, it helps us in our discussion with the Chinese on critical topics like IPR, which has been a huge, not more than just an irritant between our two nations. So I think you see most Republicans that are interested in actually having the president's administration finish it up before he leaves office.
Great, thank you. And this will have to be the last question. Right there, sir. In the middle.
Hello, my name is Matthias, and I'm from the Swedish Embassy. And Senator Sullivan, you talked about adding an energy component to the real balance strategy. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sure.
And how you envision it? And also how the recent climate agreement that the president's announced, how it plays into the broader energy policy.
Well, and then going back to my the earlier question on the Arctic, my understanding, there was a CODEL that Senator McCain led a CODEL to the Arctic a couple weeks ago, and my understanding there was a poll out that was pretty dramatic in terms of Sweden for the interest of the citizens in Sweden to join NATO, which is another very strong example of what's going on in the Arctic. I don't think 10 years ago there would have been much interest at all in Sweden to join NATO, and now I think the number is in the 70s or something like that. But with regard to energy, whether it's Japan, whether it's Korea, Korea's the biggest importer of LNG in the world. KOGAS is. And whether it's Taiwan, whether it's China, all of these countries need energy. All of these countries are looking particularly at LNG for clean burning gas. And right now, the United States went from what was looking like we're going to be an importer of LNG 10 years ago to the world's energy superpower again. Largest producer of oil in the world right now, bigger than Saudi Arabia. Largest producer of natural gas in the world right now, bigger than Russia. This is a huge opportunity for us domestically, jobs, our own energy security, but it's a huge strategic opportunity. So I'll give you one example from my home state. We are working hard. We've been working hard on it for a long time, but on a very large-scale LNG project. It would be one of the biggest LNG projects in the world. And it would get affordable gas to Alaskans, but importantly, it would get it to the Japanese, to the Koreans, and any other country in the region. That is a strategic play for us, not only in terms of energy security, but our broader national security with our allies in the region. Alaska, we've been exporting LNG to Japan for 40 years. We're the pioneer place in the world to export LNG to Asia. And we want to build upon that, and I think it would benefit the region, and it would certainly benefit the United States.
Great. Thank you so much, Senators, for your time. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for joining us. And lunch